Καλημέρα σας.
Good morning. On behalf of the Board of Directors of Hellenic Bio Cluster, I would like to welcome you in my turn and thank you for your presence here today in Stoa του Βιβλίου, the book gallery. The topic of the next presentation will be how we introduce an innovative product successfully into the market. After the excellent speech by Günther Huhl, allow me to comment that we shall not further define what innovation is. We will just accept that one of the international indicators expressing innovation is the established patent, intellectual property that is protected by a patent. And we shall have the chance to view a few parameters that allow an innovative product in the field of health, which could be either a drug or a medical device or a diagnostic device, to enter successfully not just the Greek market, but the international market as well. We have an excellent panel of speakers with renowned professionals. They are all in the consulting sector in Europe. They are all heads of consulting companies in Europe, and they are specialists on the issues of our concern. And with this opportunity, I would like to thank each one of them separately for honoring us with their presence in our meeting. And I wish that they can also enjoy Athens and their stay in Athens. So the creation of a company with a patented product which aims at the European market is necessarily in need of financial resources. And this is the topic of the first presentation, how to access finance for healthcare SMEs. The second presentation shall focus on the strategic advantages offered by a patent in healthcare, either a drug or a medical device or a diagnostic device. So we shall look into certain concepts such as a patent, what is a patent, what can be patented and what cannot be patented, what are the outcomes of a patent, and how a patent can be utilized commercially and strategically wise. The third presentation will focus on market access to different geographical areas. I believe we all acknowledge that the last years the authorization of a new drug has become very important, as well as reimbursement and pricing, especially due to the financial state of the health economics. So we shall see how pricing and the reimbursement takes place in big countries such as France, Germany, and so on, the countries of reference for pricing, and the strategies for launching products in the European market. So having covered the triptych, financial resources, patenting, and access to the market, then at the end of this session, we shall have a look at the special, particular case of innovative drugs, 35 years old in the US, that cover special needs of our fellow humans, fellow people. And these are orphan drugs for rare diseases. According to Thomson Reuters publication, the orphan drugs market in 2022 will reach the amount of $209 billion. And the presentation on orphan drugs will show us how orphan drugs and rare diseases are defined, how an orphan drug is characterized as such in the European Union, what is the situation with pediatric orphan drugs, how an orphan drug can be used before being authorized by the Drug Authorization Organization, and what is the process followed for authorization in DMA. We shall start with the first speaker, Leonid Shapiro, who is a physician and an entrepreneur, a Candesic company, the head of Candesic company. He's the founder of the company. The activities include consulting for private equity and also consulting to businesses the public sector in the field of healthcare, technology and communications in the area of strategy and marketing. He has worked for McKinsey and Hewlett-Packard. And apart from his degree in medicine, he also has a degree in physics and radiological imaging degree from Oxford. His topic is access to finance for healthcare SMEs. Leonid, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for asking me to come and speak with you. I flew in from London yesterday. I made my first mistake by wearing only this, no coat. I left London, it was 13 degrees, fairly warm. Arrived into Athens and it was 8. So I apologize for that. That's probably all my fault. I know this is a rare time you get such cold weather this time of year. But thank you very much for that great introduction. You've taken the first half of my speech up, so I'll be brief about myself. Just an explanation of why you see Brook Street here. So I am managing partner of a consulting company focused on life sciences, but I'm also a partner at an investment firm, Brook Street Equity Partners. And we invest in companies, including life science companies. And since this talk has been specifically about access to finance, I thought I would wear my Brook Street hat today. So a brief introduction to Brook Street. So we are a private equity fund. We focus on Greece and Cyprus, and we invest in high growth companies. We are more mid to late stage investors, so we don't invest into companies that are pre-revenue, but we do look to partner with companies who have phenomenal growth possibilities and help them professionalize and internationalize their firm. We picked Greece because we think there's a great opportunity here. I'm not Greek, as you can see, and I've spent quite a long time here in Greece visiting and speaking with various companies. And I have to say, there's an enormous amount of opportunity here, particularly around the life sciences segments. And unfortunately, these companies have poor access to capital. There's very few investors that are willing to put money into Greek companies historically. That's changing, but hopefully we're part of that change. Access to finance, the banking system has been obviously restricted. You've had financial restrictions from the EU and all of that. So those are all now being lifted, and we really see an enormous opportunity for you as Greek companies to flourish within Europe and globally, and we're here to help. So briefly about us, I think you've already heard the brief. I'm a doctor. I trained in the US. I did a PhD in radiology at Oxford. I was with McKinsey for 5 years, working in their life sciences and their private equity practices. Then I started Candesic about 16 years ago, and we work for both healthcare companies, but also investors looking to buy and invest money into building those healthcare companies. And I'm also a partner at Brook Street Equity Partners. These are some of the companies, these are some of the investors that we've worked for, helping get deals across the line. I've had experience working on deals as big as 14 billion euros down to 5 to 10 million euros. So it's quite a wide range. Right, so getting on to the topic at hand. So if you are running you have your own biotech company, your own healthcare company, what are the ways that you can raise money? A lot of you will be getting funding from grants historically, and be moving into getting money from revenues once you have a product that you can sell. And eventually you'll shift from grant funding to proper revenues and become self-sufficient. To accelerate that, and in some cases where you need to do clinical trials, you need more capital than grants can give you, and you don't have a product to sell. So what are your options for raising finance? to help you do that. So there are a number of ways of doing this. You could sell equity. So this is typically where you sell a proportion of your company to an investor. That brings that investor in as a true partner. So you have shared risks and rewards. It may be painful that you give up some of your company that you started it. But at the end of the day, the company is likely to be worth much, much more with the help of this investor in the future. So you have perhaps a smaller share of a much larger pie if you do this. And the downside, of course, if the company doesn't do well, the equity partner also doesn't do well. Debt is another way of doing it. This is difficult for early stage companies, of course, because there's nothing that they can securitize against their debt. But as the company grows, it's possible to get debt, and hopefully the Greek banking system will improve and allow more of this to happen. There, of course, you don't sell any of your shares, but you do make your company liable to paying the interest. So if your company does not do well, then there's a risk that you might lose the entire company. So that's kind of the flip side. Then there's mezzanine, which is somewhere in between equity and debt, or sometimes called convertible debt. This is where you take a loan, but the loan is either paid back as a loan, principal and interest, or it is converted to shares at a preferential valuation. So that is, in some cases, quite flexible, because that means that if your company does well and you have lots of cash, then you can pay off the loan and you're effectively treated as a debt instrument. If for whatever reason you can't pay off the loan and you need the money for growing the company, it gets converted to equity. So some of your shares will then be given to effectively the loan holder. And then there's upfront deals, which is a very interesting area, and I'd like to maybe spend a few moments on that. So this is where you do a deal or agreement with a partner, potentially a customer of yours. It might be a large pharmaceutical company, where they have some benefit in exchange for giving you cash. So this is not commonly used, but it has worked very well in some situations. So for example, let's say you need to run a clinical trial. It might cost you 4 million, 5 million euros to run a clinical trial. You don't have that cash. You do a deal with a pharmaceutical company who's very interested in your compound, who might want to in-license your compound if it gets through clinical trials and if it works. So you do a deal where they give you 5 million pounds to do the clinical trials. In exchange for that, they have the rights to a license to that product, or some kind of royalty from that product. It may be for a period of time. It may be for the first, so much of the product. But the point is that it's a way that large corporates can get access to evolving and innovative technologies at a relatively low cost. A few million pounds is not big to a company like Johnson & Johnson. But for you, of course, it makes the trial work and makes the company successful. So it's an option value, and I think this is something worth considering. It does take a lot more work, though, to engage, find the partners that are interested, captivate them, pitch to them, but they do exist, so it's something to look out for. So what are the types of transactions you can do? So there are buyout transactions, minority acquisitions, and this mezzanine convertible, which I've discussed before. So buyout is where you sell more or less the entire company. Typically, if you own the company, you own most of the company, this is done when you want to get rid of the company, when you sell it altogether, when you exit. However, if you are a manager of the company and you have another investor, an external investor, where you may own a small proportion of the company, but there's another investor that's funded it, then you can do what's called a management buyout. And that is where you, as a management team, go and find funding from someone like Brook Street or another private equity firm to acquire the entire company, leaving us a portion, a nice sizable portion for management, and effectively grow the company from there on. So it's a way of management taking control of a company and getting capital to grow it. And in cases where there's lots of leverage, i.e. there's a debt raised, by the buyer. So the private equity firm would go in, they would put in some cash for equity, but then they would go and get money from the bank to make the funding pot a lot bigger. So what you get at the end is you get a smaller proportion. You get a minority stake. A management team might own 20-30% of the company, but you get an enormous amount of capital to really run the company. And this is where the private equity firms get involved in supporting you in putting a chairman and a board that's very eminent, will make you connections, and really help you grow the company. Minority growth is probably something that's more common. I've spoken to some of you in the past about your companies, and this is where you own most of the company yourself, if not all. You have gotten it to a certain point. It's perhaps making some money, but it's not, expanding very quickly. And you need some growth equity. You may need some funding to run some trials, to invest in new equipment, to do something to accelerate the growth of the company. And this is where a minority investment could be very useful. So this is typically where you would sell 20, 30, 40% of the company in exchange for a block of cash, which then you can spend to accelerate the growth. And I'll talk a little bit later about what you can spend that money on. And again, this is quite important because it's not about, when you do this, you can't think about my company's worth 100 million and I need a huge amount of money. You're not selling out, you're not exiting here at all. What this is, you're taking a little bit of money off the table, perhaps a small amount, and in some cases you don't even take it off the table, you might leave it in the company. So you do it by a capital increase rather than a share sale. The point is that even though you're left with a smaller portion of the company after you do this deal, in 5 years' time, if this is successful, your company is going to be worth 10, 20, 30 times more. So you'll have, as I said, a larger, you have a smaller portion of a much larger pie. So in absolute cash, you'll have a lot more money in your pocket when you sell. So let's just spend a moment about going through the life cycle of a company. So you start your company up here, you start getting grants to fund you, for example. You don't make any revenues. You may have some investors on board as well, some angel investors. This is what we call seed capital. You start spending money to develop your product, and you enter what's this area called the Valley of Death. And this is called this way because if you do not manage to get revenues in and develop a product fast enough, you will eventually run out of cash and the company will go bust. And this happens quite a lot. If you are successful enough to break even with the funding that you have, you can then get close to break even. You can then start getting money from venture capital, early venture capital, and then at later stages when you're making some money, you can get development and growth capital. And then finally, this is where more of the buyouts occur, when you have much more stable cash flow. You also notice that in terms of debt structures like the mezzanine that I've described, and just debt in general, it tends to be towards the later stages because clearly no one's going to lend you money here. And in the early stages, it tends to be angel and venture capital investors. Do prepare to give up a sizable amount of your equity if you raise money here. You can't get away from that. I know it's hard to do, but it sometimes is the difference between survival or death. And at the end of the day, even if you give up, as I said, a third of your company, not only are you not going to die, but you might have the rest of the 2/3 of the company worth 100 times more. So it's really well worth doing that. At Brook Street, we mainly invest in this stage. So we look for companies who have a lot of growth potential and are making some money. So I mentioned the types of private equity funds. We have venture capital funds. These operate mainly on a unicorn or home run approach. So they invest in 20 companies and they expect 2 of them to make a huge amount of money. The rest, they'll be lucky if they survive. They'll probably go bust. So they can't afford to pay a huge amount of money for a small amount of equity. They expect a large amount of equity for a modest amount of money, because they know that in most of the cases they invest, they will actually lose that money. They also focus on developing intellectual property and scaling the business. And I'll talk a little bit about IP. This is essential for creating value in your company. If you don't have this, it's much harder to sustain the valuation. We talked a bit about debt. This is more of a later stage type of process, and there are funds that are specialized in these kind of convertible debts. And then buyouts are much more around focusing on sustainable cash flow generation and consolidating the industry. So here you want to not only make the company stable, you want to make the company acquire other companies and take market share. And the money that you get from these buyout funds can be used to acquire other companies or invest significantly in growth, internationalization, etc. So this is really about stabilization and expansion. So if you do make a deal with an investor, in particular a professional investor like a private equity firm or a venture capital firm, what do you expect to get in return besides cash? So there's a lot of things that a professional investor can bring you. In addition to the capital, the commercial approach that the investor brings is very important, because I've seen so many examples where there's a founder who, for example, started the company's doing well, but he's spending all his time doing sales. He's the man who goes around conferences, visits clients, he's on the road all the time, he's the founder, he's a great position to sell the products of the company. But there's only one of that person. And that person also needs to be running the lab, doing the research, hiring the staff. He's the CEO, he's the sales guy, he's the founder, he's everything. You can't build a company with having a one-man band like that. So you have to let go. You have to professionalize that business. And an investor will make you do that. So they will make you perhaps step down as CEO and become, chief scientific officer, for example. Maybe you can retain the position of chairman on the board because of you're the founder. But there needs to be someone else running the company day to day. You may want to hire a head of sales and train that salesperson to sell that company's products. Because there's no way you can scale this business by just doing the same thing you've been doing for the last 5 years, selling things yourself. You'll always be small. So the kind of things you get, you get mentorship, you get introductions, you get help with operations. Generally, you would put on your board some non-executive directors that the investor would either put themselves on, or they will hire people to join. So you get that kind of governance, professional governance support. You get introductions to customers and partners. So the private equity firm will generally have a lot of contacts with senior executives at large corporates, at pharma companies, and this is a great way of getting your head above the noise. So there's hundreds of biotech companies in Greece. If you're the one that's being put forward by a private equity firm, you're going to be listened to, because it's almost there's almost been a selection criteria. So if the private equity firm is invested in you, then it's important. Johnson & Johnson will be looking at much more interestingly to you, because you're likely to have a real product. So you get that credibility. You get quicker access to further capital. So there are private equity firms often do follow-on investments. So you will, if you need more money to do another clinical trial, or if you develop a new invention in your lab and you want more money to develop that, it's much easier to go back to the people you've already working with and get additional money from them. And as mentioned before, the investor will make you change management to improve it. So you will have more functions, more sales capabilities. So what do you do once you get your money? So you can spend it on R&D, this is of course vital, and there are many examples in biotech and life sciences where you just need money to do the clinical trials, and this is expensive. So this is obviously a great thing to spend the money on. IP protection, patents. This is essential, and I cannot stress this enough. This is essential for the long-term valuation of this company and for exit. If you don't get the IP right, you will not be able to sell this company 5 years down the road or whatever for as much as you'd like. And you will not be able to partner with bigger pharmaceutical companies unless they believe you have something unique. So spend extra time and money on making the patents, spend money on the patents and the patent lawyers to get this done properly. Then there's in-licensing and company and IP acquisition. So this is where you buy either a compound or you buy a platform or you can buy other IP or even buy an entire company. It requires cash, and getting an investor to do that is one way of deploying it. Don't be afraid to buy in. There are oftentimes a lot of very interesting technologies or compounds out there that will fit very well with what you're doing in your company and make your company more efficient. So don't be afraid about the non-invented here. This happens all the time. There's a lot of value created from these acquisitions. But also, as you're being almost an investor yourself, don't pay too much. Realize that these are very high-risk investments, and it's your job to grow them. So involve the other company, but be careful of how you spend that money. Sales, very important. As I mentioned, you got to get away from the founder, CEO, doing all the sales. You've got to establish a professional organization to do that. And talent acquisition, so this is where you hire key people in R&D, sales, other ways to develop and promote. How not to sell, or how not to spend the money. So investors hate high salaries to the senior management team / founders. Because if they put money into the business, the most they want this money to be used to develop the technology, to develop the business, not to go into the pockets of the people they just bought shares from. So stay away from this. Just because you've got 5 million in the bank doesn't mean that you suddenly can increase your salaries by 20%. It's a no-go. You don't need fancy offices or glossy marketing materials. This is something that, once you get established and you become big, you can have all that. But at the moment, all you should be caring about is making sure the science works and proving that the science works. So all your money, instead of this stuff, goes into R&D, goes into research and proof of concepts, all of those things. Obviously, stay away from stuff like this. Failing projects, very important. Don't be afraid to kill projects where that are not going well. It's important not just to have the money spent on developing things, but it's important to cut initiatives which are not going anywhere. And sometimes this will bring you more money in the long run than getting new money in. This is something that big pharma constantly do. The big pharma success are not necessarily what they get in their pipeline, but what they kill. If they wait too long to kill compounds that are not underperforming, they spend all their money on that rather than on the compounds that do perform. And don't be afraid to roll your sleeves up. Obviously, hire in consultants, lawyers, experts when needed, but if you can do it yourself, do it yourself. You can't afford, again, to spend money on stuff like that just to make things easier. To get the largest valuation, you have to prove that you have a unique scientific breakthrough. So you need to have something that's patentable, and you need something that is going to better patient outcomes. So it's got to be unique, it's got to be patentable, it's got to improve healthcare at the end of the day, and it's got to be some kind of breakthrough event so that you have this growth opportunity. And typically, as you can imagine, your valuation goes up as soon as investor risk goes down. So the investor knows that you've got something that works, it's a breakthrough, and it's protected, then it's likely to have a much higher valuation. Patents we already discussed. Customer base, you need to make sure that they're loyal, and that they grow and internationalize. So that's another thing to focus on, is how you expand outside of Greece in your customers. What funds look for typically is that they have to have growth. You have to have a talented management team. This is very important because this is almost the constant. The market will change, the science will work, will not work. If you've got a great team, they can maneuver, they can adjust. So make sure you've got a great team. You got to know how you're going to make money, that there's clearly a breakthrough. You got to be scalable. You got to be successful big as well as you are now, small, or even more successful when you're big. And in some cases, some funds look at social impact as another driver. So last slide to conclude. When you work with an investor, remember that it's a clear partnership. The investor gives you the capital and provides you the support, but you're in charge of actually meeting those objectives, the growth strategies. It is a partnership. You have a shared value creation. Around early stages, it's around IP and scalability, and late stages is about predictability of cash flows and consolidation of the industry. You have to have a path of how you make money and how you grow. And together, this is something that's done together as a team. You should always think about a clear exit. At the end of the day, you have to, in your mind, an investor is going to be there for 3, 5, 7 years maybe. Eventually, they're going to want to sell this company to a large pharma, for example. You have to have that same mentality. If you want to be in your company until you retire, it's just probably not what you should be doing. Better to have in mind saying, I'm going to sell this company in 5 years' time. This is what I'm going to achieve. These trials are going to be successful. I'm going to launch this. I'm going to in-license it. Have that plan and work towards that plan with the investor. And then if you sell out, you have lots of cash in your pocket, you can start another company or start another 2 companies. That's a much better way of being a serial entrepreneur than just doing the same thing like a professor does in a university, just doing the same thing all the time. You have to constantly think about growing, opening up new companies, etc. And I mentioned this 2 bites of the cherry. It's very important. Don't be afraid. When you go into partnership with an investor, you do have a shared motivation to grow the company. Don't be afraid to give them up some of your company, even if you don't make any money or very little money out of it, because you want the company to grow, and what's remaining, you will have more. So when you sell the second time, that's when you cash out, not when you do this first deal with the investor. So the investor has to have something in it for them as well. That's the business model of investors. So it is very much a shared motivation to grow the company, and you've got to give that opportunity for them to work with you on that. Any questions? Anybody looking for money?
Very nice and informative talk. Thank you very much. What do you think about, how strong is a patent in terms of an asset for a startup, for a new company? Knowing that, for example, places like China and so on, patents are not that strong. So how much do you value the patent, the existence of a patent?
Well, patents are very important. China is a problem, but the Chinese market, even though it's huge by number of people, the actual market, in terms of money, is limited. I mean, the U.S. is your biggest market, and then there's Europe, maybe a bit of Japan. But there is sufficient patent protection in the markets like Europe and the U.S., and that's where all the money is. That's where all the research is. Pharma is much more expensive in the U.S., for example, than it is anywhere in the world. So that's where you're going to make most of your money. China, there is definitely opportunity in China, and then there are ways of doing it, but it's almost, even if you never went to China, you would still enough market outside in the key markets for you to do it.
Great talk, thanks very much. Quick question, practicalities. Will you be available? I think you said you're going to be around January or sometime. Then?
I come to Greece once a month, typically.
Okay.
Once a month, once every 2 months, because I've got board meetings and stuff with some of the companies that we own here.
Right.
So yeah, very happy to continue dialogue. I think I've met with some of you already. It was great having discussions with you, and I hope to meet more members of the cluster. But I'll be around.
That's precisely the question. I'm wondering if it would be worth organizing again in one of your future sort of a return
Sure.
visits, kind of at least a speed sort of presentation of some of our members.
Yeah,
Great, we'll work on it.
it'd be great.
Yeah, thanks.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.